Well, this was back almost 20 years ago, and there was still a lot of debate at the time, in the US at least, about whether climate change was real or not. This was the beginning of the George W. Bush administration, and the US withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol, and it seemed to me that we really needed to answer the question once and for all whether climate change was a serious problem, and rather naively, I set out to do that for The New Yorker, and that was really what set me down this path of environmental reporting. I grew up outside New York City in a part of the world that was very much altered and has been altered for a long time, where there wasn't a lot of, weren't a lot of living creatures left. But when I was a kid, my parents used to take us out west to the American West pretty often, and that made a big impression on me. What I, at least at the time, thought of as wilderness, and I loved to go out there, and I think that really kindled my interest in the natural world. Well, that book started out as a three-part series for The New Yorker, and it was supposed to, once and for all, settle the question of whether we should be worried about climate change. And unfortunately, I guess you could say, it came down on the side, yes, we should be worried about climate change. So that was, the point of the book was really to get beyond what seemed to be a pretty pointless and counterproductive debate over this issue. Well, the Sixth Extinction really, in a way, came out of the previous book. I became really interested / concerned, I guess you could say, about what humans were doing to the planet. It seemed like, we all knew that there were various crises, but I think that the scale of the problem was not really widely recognized. And the more I reported on it, the more I was overwhelmed by what an extraordinary moment we live in time. And it's extraordinary because of our own impacts on the planet. I think people really need to understand that. Well, I think the fundamental lesson that I learned and that I tried to convey in the Sixth Extinction is that humans are changing the planet in many different ways at a rate that is too fast for other organisms to keep up with. They simply can't evolve fast enough. And when that happens, and it has happened at other moments in time in the history of life, that's why this is called the Sixth Extinction, you get a lot of species that simply drop out, and you get these pulses, huge pulses of extinction. And that is really what's happening right now. And I think it's, once again, important for people to recognize that you really, in the course of a human lifetime, you shouldn't be able to see a single organism go extinct. It's just not something that should happen very often. And yet we all know of species that have gone extinct in our own lifetimes. Well, I saw this pattern, continually, that we are very reluctant, on the one hand, to change the way we live, which is at the root of climate change, burning fossil fuels, driving, flying, heating our houses, all the things we do with fossil fuels. We're reluctant to change. It's also very hard to move this human society, which now consists of 8 billion people on the planet. And so we go looking for other ways to fix the problems that are caused by our own technologies, and we often turn to new technologies to try to fix them. And I kept seeing that impulse in people, and in the both on a political level and on a social level, and so it seemed worth writing about. Well, on some level, our only hope of fighting climate change is through new technologies, which may be, new forms of energy. We're certainly not going to go back to living the way we did before we figured out how to harness fossil fuels. And on some level, we can't, as I said, because there are so many of us and we're so dependent on what energy does for us. So on some level, if we're going to get out of this mess, it's going to be through technology, but are we going to start looking for more and more radical technologies? For example, blocking sunlight from hitting the earth, which is what the title of the book comes from, this idea of solar geoengineering. And are those going to potentially do more harm than good? Those are the big questions. Those are the serious, multi-trillion-dollar questions at the heart of the book. Well, I think, most of us live in places where we're pretty disconnected from the world as it existed prior to human settlement. The vast majority of people, certainly in North America and in Europe, live in urban and suburban settings. I think it's and we've just really lost our connection to other organisms, to the world as it was before humans. And I think it is really important for people to be exposed and to recognize that there are, something like 8, 10 million, maybe more, maybe up to 30 million other species with whom we share this planet. And they are really being seriously, that fabric of that life is being seriously unraveled, even as we speak, even as, we're sitting here right now. And I think conveying that to people, getting them to pause in the, sort of daily crush of human news and think about those other aspects of the world, which are ultimately what sustain the world, is crucially important. Well, that's a huge question, and I struggle with that every single day. But I think what I try to do, and I guess I'll just speak for myself here, is tell stories that are interesting, that interest people, even sometimes despite what they may think they're interested in. You sometimes have to get around people's sense of what they believe they're interested in and sort of circumvent that. Well, I think that you do that, again, by finding stories that are interesting. I'm really always looking for something that's slightly off kilter, not exactly the same, as you say, sort of depressing, despair-inducing story. How can we tell stories that appeal to people either because of their curiosity or their sense of wonder or their sense of beauty, that aren't just relentlessly downbeat. Well, that's extremely difficult, I have to say, and I don't have, if I had the answer to that, people would be paying a lot more attention to environmental issues than they are right now. But I think that we have to keep trying, and I think that the way, one thing that is helping us for better or really largely for worse, is I think people are seeing, especially with climate change, they're seeing the impacts of climate change in their daily lives. And I do think they're a lot more interested than they were when I started out 20 years ago, simply because everyone can see that the climate is changing. Well, I think that, yeah, we are seeing some, I don't know if throwing soup, at an artwork counts as extreme or just a stunt, to be honest. But I think that journalists need to, people are looking, young people especially, are looking for ways, just as journalists are, to really catch people's attention. I think that doesn't make it right necessarily, but I do think as journalists we need to cover that, both to give voice to the people who are trying to express themselves this way, and also to give voice to the people who find that, stupid or ridiculous or counterproductive. Well, that is a very simple question. There's a huge gap between what's needed and what's being done, and we can see that, everywhere, including, starting with climate change. Every year, a report comes out, the emissions gap report, the difference between where we should be and where we are, and every year that gap grows greater. So clearly we are not doing, what we are being told by the scientific community and what we're being told by the world around us we need to be doing. Well, it's been almost 20 years since I read that line, and unfortunately I would still stand by it, because in those 2 decades we've seen the evidence that what we're doing is extremely dangerous. That evidence has only mounted. Meanwhile, actually, our impacts on the world, particularly our emissions, have only increased. So they haven't declined. So I'm afraid I have to stick with that sentiment. But to end on a slightly higher note, I will say that I think awareness of the problem is a lot greater than it was when I wrote that back in 2004, 2005.